The Guest at the Banquet, the Witch's Cavern. Macbeth had all his promised honours now, king, Cawdor, Glamis, everything that the weird women had prophesied. But Macbeth was not satisfied. There was one danger ever present in his path. Banquo, his ancient comrade in arms, distrusted Macbeth. He suspected him of playing most foully to win his present high honours. Macbeth, for his part, feared Banquo because of his noble nature, valour, and wisdom in judgment. Outwardly he treated him with flattering civility, but inwardly he was resolved to rid himself of this dangerous companion. It was nothing to be king unless he could reign in safety. Moreover, when the Weird sisters gave the name of king to Macbeth, they had, prophet-like, hailed Banquo father to a line of kings. They placed a fruitless crown on Macbeth's head, and a barren sceptre in his grip, if no son of his succeeded. If this were so, it was for Banquo's children he had defiled his mind and murdered the good King Duncan. Only for them. Macbeth resolved to go a step further in the path of crime, and to kill both Banquo and his young son Fleance. There was to be a great feast one night at the palace. Banquo was especially invited to be present, both by Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and he promised to be back in time for the banquet, though he had to ride out that afternoon on a matter of business. Macbeth inquired if he had to ride far, and Banquo answered that it would take all the time between then and supper. Possibly he might even have to borrow an hour or two from the darkness, unless his horse went very well. "Fail not our feast," said Macbeth. "My lord, I will not," said Banquo. "We hear our cruel cousins are bestowed in England and Ireland, not confessing their murder of their father," continued Macbeth, who now pretended to believe that King Duncan's own sons had killed him. "But more of that tomorrow. Hie ye to horse. Adieu till you return at night." Then, in a voice of feigned carelessness, he asked Banquo if Fleance were going with him that afternoon. Banquo replied that he was, and that they ought to start at once, and with a few final words of civil farewell, Macbeth at last let him depart. Directly he had gone, Macbeth gave an order to an attendant, and 2 men of grim and sinister aspect were secretly ushered into his presence. These were 2 murderers whom he had hired to assassinate Banquo. When he had got their consent to the cruel deed, Macbeth told them that within the next hour he would instruct them where to plant themselves, and let them know the exact hour, for the deed must be done that night, and at some distance from the palace. He also gave them strict injunctions that the work was to be done thoroughly, and that the young boy Fleance was to be slain with his father, for his absence was just as material to Macbeth as was Banquo's. The murderers promised to obey his directions, and he dismissed them. If Macbeth were troubled in mind, and ill at ease, his wife was no happier. She had reached the height of her ambition. Her husband was King of Scotland, but the royal crown that glittered on her brow brought no charm with it to soothe the restless trouble at her heart. "Naught had, all's spent. When our desire is got without content, 'tis safer to be that which we destroy, than by destruction dwell in doubtful joy." That was the secret of their misery. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth had got their heart's desire, and in the unworthy getting of it they found it brought them no content or peace of mind. Sick at heart, weary, dissatisfied, it would have been hard to find a sadder pair that day in Scotland than the king and queen in their royal robes on the eve of their grand state banquet. But true to her old undaunted spirit, even in the midst of her own depression, Lady Macbeth tried to rouse her husband from his despondent gloom. "How now, my lord?" she said. "Why do you keep alone, making companions of sorriest fancies? Things without all remedy should be without regard. What's done is done.
"We have but scotched the snake, not killed it,"
returned Macbeth, whose mind was always brooding on the possible dangers ahead. All day he was thinking over the past, or plotting fresh wickedness to secure his own safety, and by night he was haunted by the most terrible dreams. In this constant state of unrest, he could even think with envy of the quiet repose of the man he had killed.
"Better be with the dead, whom we to gain our peace have sent to peace, than to live on in the restless torture of the mind. Duncan is in his grave. After life's fitful fever he sleeps well. Treason has done its worst, nor steel nor poison, malice domestic, foreign levy, nothing can touch him further." "Come, my gentle lord," said Lady Macbeth, "smooth your rugged looks, be bright and jovial among your guests tonight." "So I shall, love, and so I pray be you," said Macbeth. "Oh, my mind is full of scorpions, dear wife. You know that Banquet and his son Fleance live." "But they will not live forever," said Lady Macbeth. "There's comfort yet. They can be assailed," said Macbeth.
And then, in dark, mysterious words, he gave his wife to understand that a deed of dreadful note was to be done that night, though he refused to tell her more precisely what it was.
"Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck, till thou applaud the deed," he ended. "Thou marvellest at my words, but hold thee still. Things bad begun make themselves strong by evil." In the great hall of the palace the banquet was spread. The king and queen entered, with the thanes of Lennox and Ross and many other noblemen of Scotland. Macbeth bade them be seated, and gave to one and to all a hearty welcome. As the guests took their places at table, the arras hanging over a side doorway was pushed apart, and a grim face peered in. Leaving the stool, for there were no chairs in those days, which he was about to occupy at the side of the table, in the midst of the guests, Macbeth went to speak to the intruder. It was one of the hired assassins, and he brought the news that Banquet was safely slain. Macbeth was greatly pleased to hear this, but in another moment all his fear and discontent rushed back, for the young boy Fleance had escaped, the child of Banquet that was to be king hereafter. But Macbeth tried to console himself with the thought that, as he expressed it, the grown serpent was disposed of, and for the present at least, the young snake had no teeth to bite. Macbeth stood so wrapped in gloomy musing that Lady Macbeth was forced to recall him to a sense of his duties as host. Poor lady, she had a hard task that night. Not only had she to conceal her own unhappiness, but she had to support the flagging spirits of her husband, and try to screen his strange behaviour, while she scattered smiles and flattering words in all directions. Macbeth roused himself by fits and starts, but his gaiety was forced, and his wife dreaded that every moment he would betray himself. However, at Lady Macbeth's rebuke, he tried to shake off his gloom, and approaching the table, he made an effort to speak cheerfully to the guests. "May it please your highness, sit," said the Thane of Lennox. The seat which Macbeth had been about to occupy when he went to speak to the murderer had remained empty, but now, unnoticed by all the other guests, a figure glided in and took possession of it. "If only Banquet were present," Macbeth went on to say, "their honour would be complete, and he hoped it was his own fault and no mischance that had kept him away." The Thane of Ross replied that Banquet deserved blame for not keeping his promise, and again asked Macbeth to favour them with his company. "The table's full," said Macbeth. "Here is a place reserved, sir," said Lennox. "Where?" "Here, my good lord," said Lennox, pointing to the seat Macbeth had first chosen. "What is it that moves your highness?" he added in alarm. for Macbeth stood gazing in horror at what seemed to the others nothing but an empty stool. Well might the guilty king tremble and grow pale, for in the place that seemed vacant to everyone else, he saw sitting the blood-stained figure of the murdered Banquet. "Thou canst not say I did it. Never shake thy gory locks at me," he cried, recoiling in horror. "Gentlemen, rise. His Highness is not well," said the Thane of Ross. But with eager words, Lady Macbeth tried to calm the startled guests, assuring them that it was only a momentary fit of illness, such as Macbeth had been accustomed to from his youth. "Eat, and regard him not," she implored them. And then, in a stern undertone, she tried to rouse her husband from his fit of dazed terror. But Macbeth was heedless of her entreaties. With starting eyes, he watched the ghastly figure which his guilty brain alone could see, and it was only when the vision melted away that he recovered from the sort of stupor into which he had fallen. Then, for a brief moment, he spoke cheerfully, and, calling for wine, he drank to the health of all present. "And to our dear friend Banquet, whom we miss," he added boldly. "Would he were here! To all and him we drink." The words were scarcely uttered when once more the vision of the murdered man rose before Macbeth. With a scream of terror, he again recoiled, pouring forth a torrent of entreaties and defiance. Lady Macbeth once more tried to smooth matters over, but her husband's frenzied ravings could not be so lightly covered, and dreading the suspicions that his wild words must give rise to, she hastily dismissed the guests on the plea of his sudden illness. When everyone had gone, and the husband and wife were left alone, she was too worn out and unhappy to utter any further reproaches or questions. Haggard and miserable, the guilty pair stood there in the deserted hall, amid the broken fragments of the disordered feast and the dying torches that flickered in the first grey twilight of dawn. Ashes of splendor, loneliness, despair. It seemed like the emblem of their own ruined lives. Macbeth was quiet enough now. He seemed possessed with a sort of sullen desperation. He had waded so deep in blood, it would be as tedious to go back as to go forward, and he determined that any cause that hindered his own good should be ruthlessly swept aside. It was he, not Lady Macbeth, who was the leader now. Banquo's murder he had arranged alone, and he asked no counsel from his wife about a fresh deed of iniquity he was already planning. But in his guilty superstition, he resolved to go early the next day to seek the weird sisters, to learn from them, if possible, what secrets fate still held in store. The Witch's Cavern. Macbeth had gained his throne by treachery, and he had no confidence in the loyalty of his subjects. He feared lest they should plot together to bring back the sons of Duncan, and he had secret spies in the households of all the great nobles. The one he feared most, next to Banquet, was Macduff, Thane of Fife, and when the latter refused to obey the tyrant's bidding to attend the great feast, Macbeth knew that he was likely to prove a dangerous enemy, and resolved to get rid of him without delay. But before he could lay hands on him, Macduff fled the country, leaving his wife and children in his castle in Fife, and going himself to the court of the English king to beg his help in placing Malcolm on the throne. It was the day after the banquet at Macbeth's palace. In a gloomy cavern, far removed from the haunts of men, the three witches were busy brewing a hideous compound for some dark and evil purpose. In the middle of the cavern was a boiling cauldron, and as the witches circled round it in a grotesque dance, each in turn flung in some horrible ingredient. The flames crackled, clouds of hissing steam arose from the cauldron, and as they danced, the witches croaked a discordant chant.
Double, double, toil and trouble, fire, burn, and cauldron bubble.
The charm was just completed to their satisfaction when there came a knocking at the entrance of the cavern. The second witch looked up with a cunning gleam in her sunken eyes.
By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. Open, locks, whoever knocks.
The door swung open by itself, and Macbeth entered. In spite of his curiosity, he stood almost appalled at the weird scene before him. The darkness of the cavern was fitfully lighted by the leaping flames of the fire, and the evil faces that peered back at him from the shadowy gloom might well bring discomfort to a guilty soul. "How now, you secret black and midnight hags? What is it you do?" he demanded.
A deed without a name,
answered the witches in chorus. "I conjure you, by that which you profess, however you come to know it, answer me to what I ask you."
Speak, demand, we'll answer, said the witches. Say if you would rather hear it from our mouths or from our masters.
"Call them. Let me see them." The first witch flung some additional horrible charms into the cauldron, and then the three chanted together,
"Come, high or low, thyself and office deftly show."
There was a flash of light, a roll of thunder, and in the midst of a cloud of blue steam there rose from the cauldron the apparition of an armed head. "Tell me, thou unknown power," began Macbeth.
"He knows thy thought,"
said the first witch.
"Hear his speech, but say thou not."
"Macbeth, Macbeth, Macbeth, beware Macduff, beware the Thane of Fife. Dismiss me. Enough." "Whate'er thou art, for thy good caution, thanks," said Macbeth, as the apparition sank from view. "Thou hast spoken my fear aright. But one word more."
"He will not be commanded," said the witch. "Here is another, more potent than the first."
There was another roll of thunder, and a second apparition arose from the cauldron, a blood-stained child. "Macbeth, Macbeth, Macbeth. Had I 3 ears, I'd hear thee. Be bloody, bold, and resolute. Laugh to scorn the power of man, for none of woman born shall harm Macbeth." "Then live, Macduff. What need I fear of thee?" cried Macbeth. "But yet I'll make assurance double sure. Thou shalt not live, that I may tell pale-hearted fear it lies, and sleep in spite of thunder." There was a third roll of thunder, and a third apparition rose, a child crowned with a tree in its hand. "What is this that rises like the issue of a king, and wears upon his baby brow the round of sovereignty?"
"Listen, but do not speak to it,"
commanded the witches, and the apparition spoke on. "Be lion-mettled, proud, and take no care who chafes, who frets, or where conspirers are. Macbeth shall never vanquished be until great Birnam Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him." "That will never be," cried Macbeth in delighted relief, as the vision of the baby king sank back into the cauldron. As he truly said, who could remove the forest and bid the trees unfix their earth-bound roots? All the bodements were good. Fate seemed bright before him. But there was still one thing his heart throbbed to know. "Tell me, if your art can tell so much," he begged the witches. "Shall Banquo's issue ever reign in this kingdom?"
"Seek to know no more,"
came the solemn warning. "I will be satisfied. Deny me this, and an eternal curse fall on you. Let me know. Why does that cauldron sink? And what noise is that?" For there was the sound of trumpets.
"Show,
"Show, show,
show his eyes, and grieve his heart. Come like shadows, so depart."
Then in the dusk of the cavern shone a strange luminous glow, and slowly in procession passed a line of 8 kings. The last carried a mirror in his hand, and was followed by Banquo's ghost. Horrible sight! Then, after all, the witches had spoken truly, and it was Banquo's children who should fill the throne of Scotland for untold generations. For in the mirror held by the 8th king were reflected many more, and some of them carried 2-fold orbs and treble sceptres. "What, is this so?" demanded Macbeth. And the first witch answered,
"Aye, sir, all this is so. But why stands Macbeth thus amazedly? Come, sisters, cheer we up his sprites, and show the best of our delights. I'll charm the air to give a sound, while you perform your antic round, that this great king may kindly say, our duties did his welcome pay."
Then a strain of weird music was heard, and in a sort of wild mocking dance the witches vanished. The cauldron sank into the earth, and Macbeth was left standing alone in the gloomy cavern.